He was the man Hitler trusted the most and the man who lied to him the most. And yet, Hitler never suspected him. Because the greatest spy of World War II didn't hide in the shadows, didn't wear disguises, and didn't sneak through enemy lines. He simply told stories so convincing, so carefully built, so brilliantly delivered, that the most feared war machine in history shaped entire battle plans around his lies. His codename was Garbo. But before he became the legend who fooled Hitler, he was just a man no one took seriously. A man who knocked on doors, begging to be a spy, and got laughed at every time. No one knew he would go on to change the course of the greatest war in human history. His real name was Juan Pujol García, a young man from Barcelona who hated fascism with a quiet, burning fire. He had no military training, no intelligence background, and absolutely no connections. Yet he carried a belief that would shape history, that one determined man could stand against tyranny, even if his only weapon was his imagination. When the war broke out, Juan made a decision that most would consider insane. He decided he would become a spy for the Allies. Not because they asked, not because he was recruited, but because he believed it was the only way he could contribute to something far bigger than himself. He walked into the British embassy and asked for a chance to spy against the Nazis. They looked at him like he was a joke, a nobody, a dreamer. They turned him away. But Juan didn't quit. If the British wouldn't make him a spy, he would make himself one. And so began one of the boldest and strangest self-made operations in espionage history. He approached the Germans instead. He pretended to be a loyal supporter of Hitler's new order. He spoke with passion, invented stories, and offered them his services as an agent in Britain. The German intelligence service, the WWII, didn't know what to make of him. He seemed inexperienced, unconnected, and untrained. But he had something they liked: enthusiasm. And, more importantly, he sounded desperate enough to be useful. They gave him a codename. They gave him invisible ink. And they gave him a mission: go to London and report on Britain's war secrets. There was only one problem. He never went to London. Juan Pujol didn't have the money, the resources, or the support to go anywhere near England. Instead, he went to Lisbon, Portugal, sat in a hotel room, and began inventing the most elaborate fictional spy network the world had ever seen. He created imaginary agents, each with their own names, personalities, weaknesses, and backgrounds. One was a Welsh nationalist. One was a Venezuelan businessman. One worked at a shipyard. Another claimed he had access to the British Naval Command. None of them were real, but they were real enough on paper, and to the WWII, paper was everything. Juan bought British newspapers from libraries and studied them for hours. He memorized train schedules, port activity, and weather reports. He absorbed every detail of British life from magazines and travel guides. He created reports based on logic, guesswork, and the occasional completely invented detail. But he wrote them with such confidence that the Germans felt they were reading gold. His reports traveled from Lisbon to Berlin and landed on the desks of Nazi commanders who believed they were receiving high-level intelligence from deep inside Britain. One was still nothing more than a civilian sitting in a Portuguese cafe, scribbling lies on hotel stationery. And yet, those lies were now shaping Hitler's understanding of the war. The Germans were impressed. They wanted more. They demanded more. They believed he had penetrated British society so thoroughly that they asked him to recruit even more agents. And so he did, by inventing them. Soon he was managing an entire imaginary network, 27 agents strong, each one receiving payments, each one reporting regularly, each one corresponding through him. The Germans never questioned why none of these agents were ever seen or met in person. They were too busy being thrilled with the quantity and quality of the intelligence. They believed they had found their secret weapon. But Juan had a problem. His lies were becoming too successful. He knew that eventually, the Germans would demand something he couldn't fake. So, once again, he turned to the British. He walked into their office, this time in Lisbon, and explained what he had done. The British officials stared at him in stunned silence. This strange Spanish man stood there calmly, claiming he had created the most valuable German spy network in Britain from a hotel room, using newspapers. It sounded unbelievable. It sounded impossible. And yet, the evidence spoke for itself. The Germans were treating him like a star agent. This time, the British didn't laugh. They recruited him immediately. They brought him to London, gave him a handler, and assigned him to MI5's most secretive unit, the double-cross system. Now, Juan Pujol was no longer lying to the Germans alone. He had an entire British intelligence team helping him shape every detail. His reports became more polished, more precise, and more strategically crafted. With MI5's guidance, he was feeding Berlin exactly what they wanted to hear, except every detail was designed to mislead, confuse, or delay German operations. Slowly, his influence grew. His fabricated agents became trusted sources. His fictional network became a key pillar of Nazi intelligence. And Hitler, perhaps the most paranoid leader in history, trusted Garbo as if he were a loyal servant of the Reich. Hitler didn't know that he was trusting a man who despised everything he stood for. A man who was preparing the greatest deception in military history. A man whose lies would determine the fate of Normandy, of Europe, and of millions of lives. But at that moment, in early 1944, one didn't know the scale of what was coming. He only knew that the war's biggest turning point was approaching, and the Germans were desperate for intelligence. And when they asked Garbo where the Allies would land, the entire weight of the future fell onto one man who had begun this journey, simply because no one believed in him. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a general. He was one man with a pen. And the greatest lie he would ever tell was still ahead. By early 1944, Juan Pujol, now firmly established as Garbo, was no longer a shadowy figure scribbling reports in a Lisbon hotel. He was a key instrument in the Allies' plan to deceive the Germans, a man whose influence stretched from the streets of London to the war rooms of Berlin. Every message he sent, every fabricated agent he described, every carefully crafted report was a thread in an invisible web designed to ensnare the Nazi high command. And yet, for all his growing significance, one remained calm, almost annoyingly ordinary. He walked the streets of London in plain clothes, blending seamlessly with civilians, laughing with shopkeepers, and sipping tea in cafes, all while the fate of armies rested on his pen. His life was a delicate performance. Each morning he meticulously wrote reports detailing British troop movements, supply schedules, and military preparations, but always with slight exaggerations or subtle misdirections. A bridge under repair when it was intact, a convoy delayed when it was on schedule. Sometimes he even invented entire operations, never executed, just to test the Germans' reactions. He was a composer of lies, and the Germans, hungry for intelligence, became his unwitting audience. They devoured every word, never questioning the source, never suspecting that their trusted agent had never set foot in England before the war and had no network on the ground. Garbo's ingenuity was matched by his nerve. When German officers asked for proof of his agent's existence, one fabricated letters, coded messages, and even intercepted communications that didn't exist. He created elaborate backstories for each of his fictitious operatives, detailing their families, habits, and personal quirks. Berlin demanded details of sabotage plots. Juan delivered them, not real of course, but believable enough to keep the Germans convinced. He had learned the art of subtlety. Exaggerate too much and the lie would unravel. Be too cautious, and they would doubt his usefulness. It was a balance so delicate that one wrong word could mean death for him, or worse, failure of the mission. He developed relationships with his German handlers that were surprisingly cordial. Through intercepted letters, coded telegrams, and radio messages, Juan cultivated trust. They began to rely on him, consult him, even praise his intelligence. Occasionally, he would tease them with tiny truths, mundane, everyday details from Britain, just enough to make his reports believable. Berlin never suspected the majority of his network was purely fictional. In fact, the Germans became so invested in Garbo's intelligence that they considered him indispensable. Hitler himself, or at least his generals, regarded Garbo as a valuable asset capable of influencing entire strategies. The irony was staggering. A man who started as a nobody, laughed at for his audacity, now wielded the power to shape Hitler's decisions. As spring 1944 approached, the stakes rose exponentially. The Allies were preparing the largest amphibious invasion in history, Normandy. Every decision, every feint, every maneuver had to be carefully orchestrated. The Germans were desperate for accurate intelligence, for any hint of where the Allies might strike. Garbo was tasked with delivering precisely what the Allies needed them to believe. This required not only courage, but creativity. He began constructing the narrative that would ultimately define the success of D-Day. The idea that the main Allied invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, hundreds of miles northeast of Normandy. He fabricated troop movements, training exercises, and even fictitious camps, painting a picture so convincing that the Germans took it as gospel truth. For months, Juan poured his life into these false reports. He described phantom armies of hundreds of thousands of men, detailing logistics, locations, and even imaginary supply shortages. Each report was timed carefully to align with real Allied movements elsewhere, creating the illusion that the Allies were preparing for an invasion that would never occur. The Germans, eager for any insight, responded in ways that reinforced Juan's story. They sent reinforcements to the wrong regions, delayed strategic decisions, and doubted their own officers' warnings. All because one man had convinced them of a reality that existed only in ink and imagination. Yet the work took a toll. Living a life of constant deception was exhausting, even for someone as clever as Juan. Every day brought the risk of exposure. Every message carried the potential for catastrophe. He could not reveal himself, could not relax, could not make a mistake. Sleep was often a stranger. Meals were rushed and unremarkable. Friendships were superficial, built on the need to maintain appearances. But through it all, Juan's commitment never wavered. He knew that if he faltered, thousands of lives could be lost. And that knowledge fueled his determination. Occasionally, he allowed himself moments of dark humor. He imagined Hitler reading his reports, nodding in approval, utterly oblivious to the deception. He pictured Nazi generals frantically rearranging forces based on his fabricated intelligence. And he laughed quietly to himself, a single man quietly altering the course of history. He was the ultimate chess player, moving pieces unseen, predicting reactions, and orchestrating outcomes with nothing but imagination and precision. His work, invisible to most, was slowly achieving what armies of soldiers could not. Control over the enemy's perception, shaping decisions before a single battle had been fought. By early June 1944, Garbo's role reached its zenith. The Germans were convinced that the main Allied assault would be at Pas-de-Calais. They fortified the area with men and equipment, leaving Normandy comparatively lightly defended. One sent detailed messages of ongoing preparations, of phantom convoys and fake radio traffic, all timed to reinforce the illusion. Berlin's confidence in him had never been higher. They trusted Garbo more than any field commander or general. And Juan, sitting quietly in London, knew that the culmination of years of deception, the success of D-Day, depended on the Germans' willingness to believe a lie. And they did. They fell for it completely. The brilliance of Garbo's work lay not just in what he fabricated, but in how he controlled the enemy's perception of reality. He understood that war was as much about information and belief as it was about firepower. The Germans were not defeated solely by armies. They were manipulated by one man's cunning. One had become a master of psychological warfare, a silent puppeteer guiding the decisions of a nation at war. And the scale of what he was accomplishing, still largely unknown to the world, was unprecedented. A single civilian, armed only with courage, intelligence, and imagination, had gained the trust of one of the most ruthless regimes in history. In those critical weeks before the invasion, every message, every coded transmission, every tiny deception mattered. The Germans, obsessively monitoring Garbo's communications, remained blind to the true intentions of the Allies. And Juan, who had once been laughed at, who had once been told he was nobody, quietly ensured that the greatest military operation of the 20th century would meet the success it deserved. He had become invisible, yet indispensable. Ordinary, yet extraordinary. And the war, in ways few could imagine, was being won by the pen and the mind of a man who had dared to dream that one person. June 1944 arrived like a storm, silent and terrifying, carrying the weight of anticipation that could crush even the strongest minds. Across England, soldiers prepared for the largest invasion the world had ever seen, loading supplies onto landing crafts, inspecting tanks and artillery, and rehearsing maneuvers over and over. Yet thousands of miles away, the real power shaping the battlefield was not in uniforms or on warships. It was in the careful fingertips of Juan Pujol García, sitting quietly at a desk in London, pen poised, mind racing. Garbo's reports were now the compass guiding Hitler's perception of the impending assault, dictating where he concentrated forces, and controlling the flow of German decisions in ways the Allies could never have managed through brute force alone. The Germans remained convinced that the main attack would come at Pas-de-Calais. Garbo's intelligence had solidified their belief. He continued to feed them fabricated updates, describing preparations that did not exist, phantom supply convoys, and fictional troop movements in areas far from the Normandy beaches. Berlin, eager for guidance, reacted immediately. Reinforcements were sent to defend positions that were never under threat. Artillery emplacements were constructed to counter phantom armies, and reserves were held back from Normandy, leaving the beaches vulnerable to the real assault. Every carefully constructed lie of Garbo became a weapon in its own right, a tool that dictated the flow of a war that could have gone very differently if the Germans had been cautious or skeptical. Even the smallest details mattered. Garbo meticulously timed his transmissions, choosing the hours when German analysts expected updates. He varied the styles of writing slightly between agents to maintain authenticity, invented internal disagreements between his fictional operatives, and included occasional minor errors that made the communications believable. To the Germans, every inconsistency reinforced the perception of reality. They were utterly convinced, trusting Garbo more than any reconnaissance report, more than their own spies, more than intuition itself. And as he sat in London cafes, sipping tea, and observing the ordinary city life around him, Juan marveled at how fragile the enemy's certainty was, and how easily it could be manipulated. The days leading to D-Day were a tense dance of deception. Garbo's reports described rumored attacks, detailed fictional troop movements, and even fabricated supply shortages that suggested the Allies were unprepared in certain regions. Each communication was carefully designed to direct German attention away from Normandy. When German officers questioned details, Garbo responded with plausible explanations, referencing his agents who had supposedly observed these developments firsthand. Over time, Berlin became entirely dependent on him. His reports shaped Hitler's decisions in real time, influencing troop deployments and fortification strategies. The Germans never suspected that this trusted agent had no operatives on British soil, no real reconnaissance network, and no intention of reporting truthfully. Meanwhile, Juan worked closely with his MI5 handlers, coordinating the timing of double-cross operations. British intelligence fed him select real information about Allied movements that could enhance the credibility of his fabrications. He combined fact with fiction seamlessly, creating reports that felt authentic while still achieving strategic goals. Every detail mattered. The number of ships anchored in ports, the apparent readiness of divisions, even the direction of supply convoys, all meticulously crafted to support the illusion that Normandy was a minor diversion. In a way, Garbo had become the mastermind of an entire theater of war, his pen wielding more power than a general's orders or a division's artillery. He also began to test the limits of the Germans' trust. Garbo occasionally reported internal disagreements among Allied commanders, feeding small pieces of misinformation to gauge German reactions. The Abwehr responded exactly as he expected. They overanalyzed the data, adjusting their strategy according to his lies, convinced they were exploiting an inside source. Every misstep they made, every unnecessary reinforcement, every diverted artillery battery was a victory for Juan, a silent triumph of intellect over brute force. And the stakes were monumental. If he faltered even slightly, if a single message was intercepted or deemed suspicious, the Germans could act differently, and the lives of thousands of soldiers on D-Day would hang in the balance. In London, Juan's ordinary life continued as a carefully maintained illusion. He walked the streets, occasionally visited theaters, and chatted with neighbors, giving no indication of the extraordinary role he played. He met with British intelligence officers, coordinated signals, and planned upcoming transmissions. Every message required painstaking attention. Even minor errors could unravel months of deception. And yet, through all this tension, Juan remained remarkably composed, almost eerily calm. He had learned to compartmentalize the fear and focus entirely on the task at hand. In those moments, the world outside seemed ordinary, but he knew that history was being written in code and paper rather than bullets and shells. As June 5th approached, the tension in both Allied and German intelligence reached a climax. Garbo's reports indicated that the main invasion was imminent at Pas-de-Calais, complete with fictional divisions amassing for a massive attack. The Germans, reassured by Garbo's consistent intelligence over months, reinforced the area heavily, holding elite units far from Normandy. Hitler himself postponed moving divisions to respond to the true threat, trusting Garbo's analysis implicitly. Every fictional detail Garbo had constructed now played a pivotal role. The deception had worked so well that even when the Allies began landing at Normandy, German forces hesitated to react decisively, fearing the main attack was elsewhere. For Juan, the tension was almost unbearable. He spent hours preparing final transmissions, double-checking reports, ensuring every fabricated agent had a plausible reason for the observations included. The pressure of responsibility was immense. Lives, the success of the invasion, and the broader course of the war all depended on his careful manipulation of information. Yet, he never allowed panic to enter his mind. He had rehearsed every contingency, anticipated every question, and created multiple layers of plausible deception. In a strange way, the chaos of war was predictable once he controlled the flow of information. The Germans moved as he intended, almost as if guided by an invisible hand. On the night before the invasion, Juan sent his last series of pre-D-Day reports. Each contained minor updates, designed to maintain the illusion that the main Allied force would strike at Pas-de-Calais. The Germans, reassured by Garbo's intelligence, kept critical divisions in place, leaving the Normandy beaches vulnerable. Every detail had been orchestrated, every message timed perfectly. History, Juan realized, was poised on a knife's edge, and his work, crafted from lies, imagination, and intelligence, was the fulcrum on which victory would pivot. The following day, thousands of men would storm the beaches of Normandy, while Hitler and his generals miscalculated, blinded by a network of fictional agents, and the most effective deception the war had ever seen. June 6, 1944, arrived with a dawn so gray and heavy it seemed to mirror the weight of history pressing down on the world. Along the coasts of Normandy, thousands of Allied soldiers prepared to storm fortified beaches under relentless threat from entrenched German artillery. Bombers roared overhead, artillery shells screamed across the sky, and the sea churned with landing crafts carrying men who had trained for this moment for months. But thousands of miles away, in the calm streets of London, Juan Pujol García, known to Berlin as Garbo, sat quietly at a desk, listening to coded radio transmissions and monitoring German reactions. To most, he appeared calm and unremarkable, but inside his mind, every heartbeat was a calculation, every letter a potential pivot point in the fate of the invasion. The Germans, faithful to Garbo's reports, were convinced the attack would come at Pas-de-Calais. Elite divisions remained stationed there. Artillery emplacements were fixed in positions far from Normandy, and Hitler's orders were rigidly aligned with the deception. Garbo's fictional agents had painted a picture so compelling that even the most skeptical officers deferred to the trusted intelligence. Every reinforcement that could have bolstered Normandy defenses was held back, tied down by the belief that the Allies were massing their main forces elsewhere. Juan watched the intelligence traffic noting every movement, every hesitation, and felt the incredible weight of responsibility. He had manipulated history itself, and now the consequences would unfold in real time. Through the radios, Garbo continued his carefully orchestrated transmissions. He reported troop movements at Pas-de-Calais, fabricated reconnaissance observations, and minor conflicts among Allied commanders. Berlin reacted immediately, diverting attention and resources to respond to threats that did not exist. Even when the first reports of landings in Normandy began to reach the German high command, they hesitated, suspicious that this was merely a diversion, a ruse to draw them into a trap. Garbo had trained them well. The Germans had learned to trust him more than the reality unfolding before their eyes. Every hesitation, every delay, was another layer of protection for the soldiers facing the beaches. Juan's work in these critical hours required precision beyond anything he had done before. He had to maintain the illusion even as the actual invasion began. He transmitted reports that the Allies were continuing to prepare at Calais, that convoys were moving there, and that only minor commando raids were occurring in Normandy. Berlin swallowed each report, analyzing and reacting exactly as he intended. German divisions were mobilized, tied to the phantom threat, while the invasion unfolded successfully on the beaches below. He was guiding enemy decision-making from afar, manipulating outcomes with the precision of a chess master controlling pieces from a distant room. The hours passed with unbearable tension. Every incoming message had to be interpreted, every outgoing transmission carefully constructed to reinforce the deception without revealing the truth. The Allies on the beaches were engaged in brutal combat. Gunfire, smoke, and the chaos of battle filled the air. Meanwhile, Garbo remained detached in appearance, observing from a distance, his influence invisible but absolute. He could see the German reaction patterns through intelligence reports. Hesitation, misallocation, disbelief. And he knew that every split-second decision made by the enemy, every movement delayed or misdirected, was a victory wrought not with force, but with intellect and strategy. As the day progressed, Juan received reports of partial German counterattacks toward Normandy. He crafted messages that explained the movements as minor disturbances, reinforcing the belief that Pas-de-Calais remained the true target. German forces were indecisive, unable to redeploy in time, and the Allies began securing footholds on the beaches. Each message Juan sent was a careful balance. Too much reassurance of success could alert the Germans. Too much detail could expose the deception. He navigated this tension expertly, sending the right words at the right time, ensuring the illusion held even as the reality of the invasion became undeniable. Garbo's genius was not only in the fabrication of false intelligence, but in the timing, the subtle manipulation of perception, and the orchestration of expectation. Berlin believed that every action he reported was real, that every agent he created had observed the battlefield personally. The Germans misread the scale of the assault and misallocated resources. Hitler, relying on Garbo's consistent reports over the preceding months, reinforced his focus on Pas-de-Calais, leaving the Allies with a crucial strategic advantage. Juan, hidden in London, realized the enormity of what was happening. One man's imagination and courage were now dictating the movements of armies and the fates of thousands of soldiers. By late afternoon, the Normandy landings were gaining momentum. Beachheads were established, key positions secured, and resistance, while fierce, was overcome due in large part to the enemy's miscalculations. Juan continued transmitting, creating the illusion that the assault was minor, just preliminary raids, while simultaneously reinforcing his narrative that the real attack would occur elsewhere. The German response remained sluggish and confused. Units sent to confront the main attack arrived too late or in insufficient numbers. Through his letters and radio messages, Garbo had achieved the impossible. He had turned an overwhelming invasion into a manageable operation by controlling the enemy's perception rather than its reality. Even as night fell, Juan did not rest. He monitored reports, confirmed enemy positions, and sent final transmissions to reinforce the illusion for the following days. The Germans, still expecting an assault at Pas-de-Calais, did not fully grasp the scale or success of the Normandy operation. Garbo had bought the Allies the precious time they needed to consolidate positions, secure supply lines, and begin advancing inland. From the quiet of a London office, he had become one of the most powerful figures of the day, an unseen hand shaping history itself. By the end of June 6th, the outcome was clear. The Allies had achieved the first phase of their invasion, the beaches held, and German forces paralyzed by misinformation. Juan Pujol García, who had started as a desperate man seeking to fight fascism with nothing but courage and creativity, had delivered the single most effective intelligence operation of the war. His work would not only determine the success of D-Day, but also pave the way for the liberation of Europe. Yet he remained calm, invisible, almost ordinary. History had been altered by his lies, yet to the world he was just another civilian, quietly completing his daily routine, a shadow among millions, carrying the secret of victory in his mind. And even as the first victories on Normandy's beaches were celebrated, Juan knew the war was far from over. There would be more deception, more risk, and more responsibility. The greatest challenges still lay ahead, and Garbo's ability to manipulate perception, control information, and outthink the enemy would remain critical to the Allies' success. The invasion had begun, but the war of the mind, the war of intelligence and deception, was only just entering its decisive phase. The weeks following D-Day were a whirlwind of movement, strategy, and relentless fighting. Allied forces pushed inland from the beaches, securing towns, roads, and supply lines, while German units scrambled to respond to threats that had never existed. Every step of the advance was eased by the hesitation Garbo had engineered in Berlin, every successful maneuver aided by months of meticulous deception. And yet, for Juan Pujol García, the work was far from over. Victory was never immediate. It was measured in careful manipulation, in subtle psychological warfare, and in sustaining the illusion that had become his most powerful weapon. Even as Allied victories mounted, Juan continued to feed Berlin false intelligence. He described continued preparations at Pas-de-Calais, phantom troop movements, and non-existent attacks along the French coast. The Germans remained completely convinced that the Normandy invasion was a diversion, tying down divisions that might have altered the course of the land campaign. Hitler's obsession with Garbo's reports grew. The Führer trusted him implicitly, never imagining that this Spanish man, once dismissed as a fool, had no agents on British soil and no intention of telling the truth. The deception was so complete that even the end of June found German commanders wary of moving their forces, still anticipating a strike at Calais that would never come. Juan's life in London remained deceptively ordinary. He walked the streets among civilians, drank tea in cafes, and read newspapers, masking the extraordinary role he played in the liberation of Europe. To the public, he was invisible. To Berlin, he was indispensable. In the secrecy of MI5 offices, he met with handlers to plan the next phases, ensuring the Germans continued to be misled for months to come. Every message he sent, every agent he described, every tiny detail was designed not merely to deceive, but to shape strategic outcomes in real time. The enormity of what he had achieved, safeguarding thousands of lives and altering the path of the war, was almost impossible to comprehend, even for him. As the Allied advance accelerated, rumors of Garbo's exploits began to circulate among British intelligence. His success had become legendary within the secretive halls of MI5. Officers marveled at the audacity of a man who had invented an entire network of agents, fooled the most ruthless intelligence service in history, and altered the course of the greatest military operation of the 20th century. Yet outside those walls, Juan remained silent. He refused accolades, refused attention, and never sought fame. The mission had never been about recognition. It had always been about achieving the impossible through intelligence, creativity, and courage. Eventually, the war moved toward its conclusion. Berlin crumbled under the pressure of Allied advances. Hitler's generals were paralyzed by decades of deception, and the Reich faced inevitable defeat. Even then, Garbo's work continued to protect Allied operations. He had become a living symbol of how information, perception, and strategy could be more powerful than armies or weapons. And, as Germany collapsed, he was quietly extracted from his duties, his contributions classified and hidden from the world. Unlike generals or political leaders, his legacy was not in monuments or headlines, but in the countless lives spared by his ingenuity. After the war, Juan Pujol García faced a peculiar challenge. His work had been so secret, so deeply embedded in the machinery of deception, that revealing himself could endanger lives and compromise the security of other operations. For a time, he disappeared into anonymity, living under assumed identities in South America, avoiding publicity, and reflecting on the unprecedented journey that had begun with a single act of courage. He had transformed from a desperate man seeking to fight fascism into one of history's greatest double agents, a man whose imagination and intellect had outmaneuvered one of the most fearsome regimes in history. When his story finally became known decades later, the world marveled. Garbo's brilliance lay not in daring raids or combat heroics, but in the subtle, almost invisible art of deception. He had demonstrated that a single individual, armed with creativity, patience, and nerve, could shape global events. He had turned lies into weapons, misinformation into strategy, and imagination into power. His genius lay in understanding that war was not just fought with guns and tanks, but with the human mind, the ability to manipulate belief, perception, and expectation. Juan himself remained humble. He rarely spoke of his experiences, and when he did, it was with a quiet sense of purpose rather than pride. To him, the war had been a test of intellect and courage, and he had been fortunate enough to succeed. He often reflected on the strange journey that had brought him from the streets of Barcelona to the highest echelons of espionage, a man laughed at, dismissed, and underestimated, who had used nothing but ingenuity and audacity to influence the most powerful leaders of his time. The impact of Garbo's work was immense. The success of D-Day, the liberation of France, and the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany were all influenced, in part, by a network that had never existed, a web of lies so perfectly crafted that it had become reality in the eyes of the enemy. Hitler's obsession with Garbo and his unwavering trust in the intelligence provided demonstrated how perception could be more powerful than reality. Entire strategies, decisions, and movements of armies had been dictated not by soldiers on the ground, but by the careful manipulation of information. One man had changed the course of history. In the end, Juan Pujol García, Garbo, the man who had dared to believe he could make a difference, became a legend, not through combat, but through cunning, courage, and the quiet power of intelligence. His story remains a testament to the extraordinary influence of a single individual, a reminder that wars are won not only by firepower, but by strategy, imagination, and the ability to deceive the enemy with precision and brilliance. History remembers the generals, the soldiers, and the battles, but it is the invisible heroes, those who operate in shadows, whose pens shape destinies, who often change the world most profoundly. Garbo had done precisely that.